General Theory of Inverse Functions. Welcome. Before we proceed to the study of inverse trigonometric functions, it is essential that we first establish a solid understanding of the general mathematical theory of inverse functions. To put it simply, an inverse function is a function that effectively reverses the operation or action performed by the original function. To illustrate this, if a function, which we will call f, takes an input x and produces an output y, then the inverse function, denoted as f inverse, takes that output y and maps it back to the original input x. However, it is important to note that not every function possesses an inverse. For a function to be invertible, it must satisfy certain specific mathematical conditions, which we will explore in detail in the following slides. Conditions for the existence of an inverse. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, not every function can be reversed. For a function, let's call it f, which maps set A to set B, to have an inverse function, denoted as f inverse, which maps set B back to set A, it must satisfy a very specific condition. It must be a bijective function. But what exactly does it mean for a function to be bijective? Simply put, a function is considered bijective if it meets two distinct criteria. It must be both 1, which is also known as injective, and onto, which is also called surjective. In the next few slides, we will dive deeper into each of these terms to understand exactly why both are necessary for an inverse to exist. 1 function injective. Now that we have established that a function must be bijective to have an inverse, let us examine the first of the two necessary conditions, the 1 function, which is also referred to as an injective function. In simple terms, a function is said to be 1 if different elements in the domain produce different elements in the codomain. This means that every unique input must map to a unique output. No two different inputs can share the same result. To express this more formally in mathematical terms, a function f is 1 if the statement f of x sub 1 equals f of x sub 2 implies that x sub 1 equals x sub 2 for all x sub 1 and x sub 2 in the domain. Essentially, this tells us that if the outputs are the same, the inputs must have been identical to begin with. But why is this condition absolutely necessary for an inverse to exist? Consider the alternative. If two different inputs, such as x sub 1 and x sub 2, both produced the same output, why the inverse function would encounter a problem. When the inverse function is given the value y, it would not know which original input to return to. Because a mathematical function is required to give exactly one output for any given input, this ambiguity would violate the fundamental definition of a function. Therefore, the 1 property ensures that the path back from the output to the input is unique and clear. Onto function surjective. Now that we have discussed 1 functions, let us move on to the second essential condition for a function to have an inverse, the onto function, which is also known as a surjective function. A function is said to be onto if every single element in the codomain, which we have labeled as set B, has at least one preimage in the domain, set A in simpler terms. This means that every possible output in the target set is actually reached by the function. To express this using a formal mathematical definition, a function f, mapping from set A to set B, is onto if for every element y in set B, there exists an element x in set A such that f of x equals y. This ensures that the range of the function is exactly equal to its codomain. You may ask, why is this property necessary for the existence of an inverse? Well, remember that an inverse function is designed to reverse the original process. If there were elements in set B that were not mapped to by any x in set A, the inverse function would have no starting point to return to when given those specific values. This would leave the inverse function undefined for certain parts of its domain, and by definition, a function must be defined for all elements of its domain. Once we ensure a function is both 1, as we saw in the previous slide, and onto, as we have just discussed, we can conclude that the function is bijective, which we will explore in the next slide. Conclusion on bijective functions. Now that we have explored the concepts of 1-1 and onto functions individually in the previous 2 slides, let's bring them together. When a function satisfies both of these conditions, meaning it is both 1-1 and onto, we use a specific mathematical term to describe it. We call it a bijective function. This leads us to a very important conclusion. Only bijective functions have a well-defined inverse. As we discussed earlier, if a function isn't 1-1, the inverse wouldn't know which input to return to, and if it isn't onto, there would be gaps where the inverse is undefined. Therefore, bijectivity is the absolute requirement for an inverse to exist. With this fundamental requirement clear, we can now move on to see how the domain and range of a function behave when we transition to its inverse. Relationship between domain and range. Now that we have established that only bijective functions possess an inverse, let us examine how this affects the sets involved in the mapping. Essentially, when we find the inverse of a function, the roles of the domain and the range are completely swapped. To illustrate this, suppose we have a bijective function, f, that maps set at a set B. In this case, the domain of function f is set A, and the range, which is the set of all resulting outputs, is set B. The inverse function, which we denote as f inverse, performs the reverse operation. Therefore, f inverse is defined as a mapping from set B back to set A. Consequently, this leads us to 2 fundamental conclusions. First, the domain of the inverse function, f inverse, is identical to the range of the original function, f, and second, the range of the inverse function, f inverse, is identical to the domain of the original function, f. Understanding this swap is crucial, as it sets the stage for our next discussion on how these 2 functions behave when they are composed together. Properties of function composition. Now that we have established the conditions for a function to be invertible, let's examine how a function and its inverse interact through a process called composition. In simple terms, composition is when we apply one function to the result of another, essentially creating a chain of operations. Assuming we have a bijective function, which we've already discussed is a requirement for invertibility, let's call this function f, and its corresponding inverse function f inverse. When these 2 interact, 2 fundamental properties hold true. First, let's look at what happens when we apply the original function f first, and then apply the inverse function f inverse. In mathematical notation, this is expressed as f inverse composed with f of x, which is the same as saying f inverse of f of x. The result of this operation is simply x, for all x in the domain of f. To put this in plain English, if you start with an input x, apply the function to get an output, and then apply the inverse to that output, you are brought right back to your original starting value, x. Conversely, we can reverse the order. If we start by applying the inverse function f inverse, and then apply the original function f, this is written as f composed with f inverse of y, or f of f inverse of y. The result here is simply y, for all y in the domain of f inverse. This means that if you start with a value y, apply the inverse function to find its preimage, and then apply the original function to that preimage, you return to the original value y. Essentially, the function and its inverse undo each other. This conceptual undoing is the core of inverse theory, and in the next slide, we will apply these properties to a concrete mathematical example to see this in action. Illustrative example. Now that we have covered the theoretical definitions of 1-1 and onto functions, let's move on to slide 8, where we will see these concepts in action through an illustrative example. To begin, let's use a real-world analogy to make the concept of an inverse more intuitive. Imagine you are using a secret code where every letter of the alphabet is shifted one position forward. For instance, A becomes B, B becomes C, and so on. In this scenario, the process of encoding the message represents our function, f. To retrieve the original message, you would need to decode it by shifting every letter one position backward. This decoding process is the inverse function, f inverse. This system is bijective because it is 1-1, meaning every letter has exactly one unique encoded partner, and it is onto because every letter in the alphabet is utilized. Now, let's transition from the analogy to a formal mathematical example. Consider a function f, mapping the set of real numbers to the set of real numbers, defined by f of x equals 2x plus 3. To determine if an inverse exists, we must first follow the steps we discussed in the previous slides. Step 1 is to check if the function is 1, 1. We start by assuming that f of x1 equals f of x2. This gives us the equation 2x1 plus 3 equals 2x2 plus 3. By subtracting 3 from both sides, we get 2x1 equals 2x2, and by dividing by 2, we find that x1 equals x2. Because the assumption that the outputs are equal leads us to the conclusion that the inputs must also be equal, we can confirm that the function is 1, 1. Step 2 is to check if the function is onto. We let y be any real number in the codomain and determine if there is an x in the domain such that f of x equals y. Setting up the equation y equals 2x plus 3, we solve for x subtracting 3 from both sides and then dividing by 2, we find that x equals y minus 3, all divided by 2. Since we can find a real value for x for any real value of y, the function is onto. Now that we have established that the function is both 1, 1 and onto, and therefore bijective, we can proceed to step 3, finding the inverse. From our work in step 2, we already found the expression for x. Therefore, the inverse function, f inverse of y, is equal to y minus 3 divided by 2. Finally, in step 4, we verify this result using function composition, which we introduced in the previous slide. We want to see if applying the inverse to the original function returns us to our starting value. We calculate f inverse of f of x by substituting the original function into the inverse. We get f inverse of 2x plus 3. Plugging this into our inverse formula, we have 2x plus 3 minus 3, all divided by 2. The positive and negative 3 cancel each other out, leaving us with 2x divided by 2, which simplifies simply to x. This confirms that our inverse function correctly reverses the operation of the original function. Keep this process in mind, as we will soon see how this logic applies to trigonometric functions, where we often have to restrict the domain to ensure bijectivity. Key takeaways. Now that we have walked through the definitions and a practical example, let's summarize the key takeaways from this section to ensure we have a solid foundation. First, the most important requirement is that a function must be bijective in order to have an inverse. As we have discussed, being bijective is simply a way of saying the function is both 1, 1 and onto. To recap the first condition, a 1, 1 function is one where each input is paired with a unique output. This is what prevents any ambiguity when we try to reverse the process. Secondly, the function must be onto, meaning that every possible output in the target set is covered. This ensures that the inverse function doesn't encounter any empty values that it cannot map back to. Next, remember the relationship between the domain and the range. When we transition from a function to its inverse, these two sets swap roles. In other words, the domain of f becomes the range of f inverse, and the range of f becomes the domain of f inverse. Finally, let's remember the property of composition. If you apply a function and then apply its inverse, you return to your original starting value. This is expressed as f inverse of f of x equals x, and similarly, f of f inverse of y equals y. With these core principles clear, we can now move on to the next slide, where we will discuss some common mistakes and misconceptions to avoid, particularly regarding notation and functions that are not naturally bijective. Common mistakes. Now that we have covered the theoretical framework and a practical example, let us conclude this section by discussing some common pitfalls. It is very important to be aware of these to avoid errors in your calculations and conceptual understanding. First, let's address a frequent point of confusion regarding notation. In your previous algebra studies, you learned that raising a variable to the power of -1, such as x to the power of -1, represents the reciprocal, which is 1 over x. However, in the context of functions, the notation f inverse of x does not mean 1 over f of x instead. It denotes the inverse function, the one that reverses the mapping of the original function, as we discussed in the earlier slides. This is a critical distinction that you will encounter very soon when we study trigonometric functions, specifically when distinguishing between sine inverse of x, which is the inverse function, and the reciprocal of sine, which is 1 over sine of x. The second common mistake is the assumption that every function automatically has an inverse. As we established in the beginning of this lesson, a function must be bijective, meaning it must be both 1 and onto to be invertible. For example, consider the function f of x equals x squared. Many students instinctively try to find its inverse, but if we apply the 1 test, we see that it fails. This is because both positive 2 squared and negative 2 squared result in the same output, which is 4. Since two different inputs produce the same output, the inverse would be ambiguous. To resolve this, we must restrict the domain, which means we limit the possible input values to a specific interval where the function is 1. This concept of domain restriction is exactly how we will handle trigonometric functions in the upcoming sections of this course.